Okay, so as you know, there are a ton of really bad NFL franchises out there that seemingly go through a rough patch every couple of seasons, but eventually the law of averages does set in for at least 1 year. But then there are other franchises, special ones, like the Detroit Lions, an organization that has been so miserable, people have turned to explain their immeasurable levels of pain by blaming a curse. And since 1957, 67 years ago, the Detroit Lions haven't even come close to winning anything. Until very recently. So the question just has to be asked still though, right? I mean, simply, how? How has a multi-billion-dollar franchise constantly just lost over and over again? But, you know, this video isn't just going to be about depression, because very recently, as you probably know, the Detroit Lions have begun to build something, and we'll get there when we get there, so I'm not going to spoil the surprise on how things are going to get happy, but as of right now, it's going to start grim, okay? And we're going to go all the way back to the 2008 Lions campaign to really figure out where things all went wrong in the beginning and how much later on, finally, the Lions franchise was able to be redeemed. Alright, you ready? Because in order to end up in a land of happiness and flowers and things of that nature, we gotta go through the mud first. So let's journey back into the filth before the year 2008, where I mean, if you want to call the Lions a professional sports team, you wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but me personally, I look at this era of Detroit Lions football as more of a traveling psychological experiment to see how much pain a fan base can endure. So, with that, this is Matt Millen, a former really good linebacker in the 80s, but as an executive, it turns out he was the perfect man to lead the Lions to the worst league-wide record over a 7-year span. And after being hired to join the Lions front office in 2001, the man got to cooking, drafting household names like Joey Harrington in 2002, third overall, only to help run him into the ground. And then from 2003 to 2004, Millen's grand plan all came together when in back-to-back drafts, the Lions decided to take 2 wide receivers in a row, consisting of dudes you probably haven't heard of for good reason. And because that wasn't bad enough, in 2005, 1 year later, when they had already taken 2 wideouts 2 years in a row, Matt Millen was on the phone with future Hall of Fame linebacker DeMarcus Ware, and the Lions were seconds away from handing in the pick and taking the man himself, but then, Christ. Allegedly, some Lions scouts, moments before the pick was actually official, apparently were talking about how explosive the combination of Mike Williams and Roy Williams could be, and how the Lions will surely be the next greatest show on turf. And you know what Matt Millen said to that? He said, alright, yeah, that's good enough for me. F it. Let's take wide receiver Mike Williams over DeMarcus Ware just for shits and giggles. DeMarcus Ware was then drafted 1 pick later by the Cowboys, and Matt Millen got punched by his son. So that's the level of incompetence we're dealing with. And that's not even mentioning certain other stuff going on behind the scenes, but neither of us has got the time for that. So the 2008 season then went by, and luckily it was a fresh breath of air. The Lions went 0-16, and had a year that was so bad, it wasn't even worth getting upset about, to be honest with you. At some point, a franchise reaches such a high level of incompetence that all you can do is sit back, laugh, and watch the train go off the tracks with a devilish grin on your face. Because if the players and higher-ups and the Ford family, who still owns the Lions to this day, don't care about the product on the field, then why the hell should the fans? Instead of reaching quarterback John Kitna's prophesized 10-win mark, the 2008 Lions logged debatably the worst season in NFL history. In terms of talent, they had Calvin Johnson, one of the greatest players in NFL history, and they also had, Jason Hanson. He was a kicker who was, solid sometimes, and that's really it. This team was so untalented, it was incomprehensible. And their defense was ranked dead last, the offense was arguably dead last, and they finished the year becoming the first team to never win a game since 1983, and honestly, the Lions were only maybe in 2 or 3 games that entire year, so they really were just that bad. So, believe it or not, after not winning a game for an entire season, the Lions decided finding a new GM and head coach was the right decision moving forward. So, before Lions coach Rod Marinelli could completely lose his sanity, he was gone and Matt Millen went along with him. And in came head coach Jim Schwartz and general manager Martin Mayhew. And most importantly, because the Lions were just far too dominant in 2008, they were awarded the #1 overall selection. And in came their new toy, who they would toss around back and forth until he broke. Luckily, because of his dominance in college, though, the Lions could not have conceivably thrown this pick away, and were basically forced into drafting Georgia's John Matthew Stafford first overall. And no, I didn't make that up. Matthew Stafford's real name is actually John. Cool, right? Anyways, the 2009 and 2010 seasons for the Lions were ones to forget. Not saying there was nothing from this era that mattered, but overall, it was still just more of the same. The Lions still had the worst record in the NFL over a 2-year stretch, but even in the darkest of ecosystems, life always finds a way to bloom, because on top of the talent that was already there, General Manager Martin Mayhew and the staff drafted rookie All-Pro defensive tackle Ndamukong Suh second overall. So, Ndamukong and his techniques changed the defense from bottom 1 in 2009 all the way up to bottom 10, so progress was being made. And on offense, the Matthew Stafford to Calvin Johnson connection was actually unironically lethal when they actually played together, though, because although they were arguably the best wide receiver quarterback connection in the league, in 2 years, the pair only played 12 games together, and most of that came in 2009 because in the 2010 season, Matthew Stafford suffered a shoulder injury in the first game of the year, and then he re-aggravated it again in November, knocking him out for the entire season. And believe it or not, high-end talent actually existed in this barren wasteland, but remember, you can't have true misery without a little tease of success, and that's what Lions fans were learning. With guys like Megatron, Stafford, and Ndamukong Suh, there was more than a ton of potential there, and the media was starting to get on board with that idea too, and there were some real wild people out there saying that the Lions had a decent chance at making the playoffs in 2011 if Matthew Stafford stayed healthy. All right, let's hold on here for a minute, okay? Slow our roll. Playoffs? For the Detroit Lions. Do you know what franchise we're talking about here? This is still the same organization that didn't win a game in 2008, so they still had a long way to go. And no offense, but going into the 2011 season, their offseason acquisitions heading into 2011 were creative, I guess. In hindsight, the free agent signing of Browns cornerback Eric Wright was disappointing at best, and linebacker Stephen Tulick would become somewhat productive, but to be honest, the only reason I'm mentioning him is because we're all going to laugh at him later on. And in the 2011 draft, the Lions just barely missed out on J.J. Watt, so they settled for Auburn defensive tackle Nick Fairley, who... What is a menacing charge? Okay, whatever. But immediately after drafting Nick Fairley to rub a salt bomb in that wound, the next 3 guys taken off the board in Robert Quinn, Mike Pouncey, and Ryan Kerrigan would all turn out to be Pro Bowlers, and honestly, if I really want to be a dick about it, Nate Soldier was the 4th guy in a row picked after Fairley, and he really could have helped Detroit out if they took him, but I guess in their defense, you could argue that Nick Fairley was actually just a better prospect than all of those guys at the time. Now, like I said, expectations weren't sky high, but there were expectations, which is absolutely foreign to an organization that hasn't won a playoff game since 1991 at this point. But going into the 2011 season, the Detroit Lions had a great year and turned in quite possibly their most magical campaign to date. Oh, 5-0! The Detroit Lions won 5 games and lost 0, and were neck and neck with the Green Bay Packers. The Green Bay Packers, a well-run franchise, who were led by Aaron Rodgers, having the best season of any quarterback ever, and the team as a whole was fresh off of a goddamn Super Bowl. And there were actually logical debates going on questioning which of these two teams were better. And they weren't just getting lucky. I mean, this Lions team was straight up bullying people. They beat Kansas City, who won 7 games that year, by 45 points. Still to this day, the largest margin of victory in Lions history. And in Week 4 versus Dallas, the Lions trailed 27-3 at one point, but I guess as recent events have showed us, 27 is just not a good number for the Cowboys, so of course they ended up blowing that one too. Now, the Lions were back, right? I mean, video over. This truly was the year where the Lions became respected again, but things quickly began to fall apart. First, emerging star running back, former first-round pick Javad Best, suffered another one of his many concussions after a game versus the 49ers and would never play in another game in the NFL again. So, average Lions fan moment. But to go back to the positives, sort of, through the first 5 games, Calvin Johnson was just on another level. A 29-yard game from their 50-point blowout is really dragging these numbers down, but just take my word for it, please. Calling Megatron a football player during this stretch of games would just be disrespectful to his craft, okay? My man was catching 2 touchdowns a game from Stafford, but unfortunately that just isn't sustainable. So Calvin began cooling off, drawing more defensive attention his way, and without a running back to take off that pressure, the offense just got worse. And then the defense, more specifically the secondary for Detroit, started to just get roasted alive. The previously mentioned Eric Wright, the Lions corner who they signed a while back, would be executed after this historically abysmal campaign and would never even be seen near the city again, but in 2011, the man excelled in his role as the team jester. He finished the season as the second most targeted corner in the NFL, as the Lions gave up 30 points per game in the final 8 games of the season. And all that was enough to tank the best regular season of Matthew Stafford's career. I mean, bruh, what are we doing here? The man threw for 5,000 yards and 40 touchdowns with a near 100 passer rating, and the guy didn't even make the Pro Bowl. But the real answer as to why he didn't make it wasn't just nobody cares about Detroit, although that was probably part of it. But the real answer as to why he didn't make it was partly the same reason why the Lions only finished the 2011 season with a 10-6 record. And that was because, well, the NFL was actually just that stacked during this year. Seriously, despite the joy of clinching the playoffs with a win over the Chargers, and even with Matthew Stafford balling out of his mind, little attention was thrown Detroit's way because the aforementioned Aaron Rodgers and Drew Brees were both churning out 2 of the greatest individual player seasons in NFL history. And throughout the regular season, the Lions were good, but a solid step behind the NFL's best, losing to the Packers twice, the 49ers, Falcons, and Saints during the regular season. And unfortunately for the Lions, they were matched up against none other than Drew Brees and the New Orleans Saints in just the wild card round, so you can thank Drew for all over this blue hype train, and they did fight, but you don't get remembered for trying hard. And Matthew Stafford, Calvin Johnson, and the others were smeared by the Saints 45-28 in their first playoff appearance in a decade. See, this is where they get you, okay? They had all the potential to be a good, if not great team. Jim Schwartz proved that he could coach, in theory, and all seemed to be well for the future. And in 2012, the dynamic duo of Stafford and Calvin Johnson played together in all 16 games, and Megatron even made an all-pro team. But after week 9, the Lions were struggling so badly that they were 4-4, and going into a week 10 matchup with the Minnesota Vikings, basically their entire season rested on how that game would result. And when I say this matchup was important, I mean it from the heart, okay? At one point, the Lions were 1-3 during the season, and then they kind of turned their season around, so now another challenge was waiting for them, and it was so important to get this win. But no, they couldn't do it.
Save me a slice. That's good. Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's all right. That's good. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Okay, that's good. That's good. It's enough slicing.
So the Lions fell right back into their old ways. I understand that the pit is warm, but you gotta get out of it someday. And despite being pretty healthy, they only won 4 games on the entire season. So it was time to fix things, which thankfully the Lions have proved over the past couple of years. They're just great at that. But actually, shockingly, the Lions management didn't do a terrible job in this offseason. Glover Quinn was the main man brought in to aid in the fixture of the defense that also gained 2 massive rookies in Darius Slay and Ziggy Ansah. And the year started off good internally, but externally, the gods looked down upon the Lions, and for the first time in eons, they smiled. Because in week 10, the Lions sat on top of the NFC North with a 6-3 record, and even better, both Bears' future Hall of Fame quarterback Jay Cutler and future Jets crash dummy Aaron Rodgers would miss multiple weeks at least, so the division was quite literally theirs for the taking. But please don't forget this, okay? Listen up closely. This is the Detroit Lions we're talking about. Something I'm going to constantly remind you throughout this video, because it is important, and sadly, they can't escape their confinement of misery. But for the rest of us, it's all part of the fun, right? So, enter week 12. The Detroit Lions desperately needed a win versus the Mike Glennon-led Bucks. And if there was ever a game to sum up how it feels to be a Lions fan during this era, good God, this game. This game was it, okay? So, you know the gist of how things go. Matthew Stafford threw a pick 6 because his tight end actively dodged the football, but because the Bucks were a horrendous NFL team in every facet of the word, this was still a very competitive football game. The Bucks even had a 24-21 lead late in the fourth quarter on the road in Detroit, but As the Lions began to drive, they committed actually one of the worst fumbles I've ever seen in my life, which brought the Glennon back onto the field. And after a missed field goal, it was time for Stafford to return to the field. And the man was just in his element. This was his thing. If Matthew Stafford was the master of one singular football trait, it was the 2-minute drill. And after bringing the Lions inside the 30, Calvin Johnson, of all people, has the ball knocked out of his hands and right into the midst of Tampa. And the Lions lost the game, once again, to Mike Glennon's Tampa Bay Buccaneers. A team that would go on to win just a singular game after this one fell to them 21-24. The collapse was on the horizon, but if there was to be a last stand for Detroit, it would come in Week 15 versus the Ravens, and the game was just not fun to watch. I'm going to be honest with you. The Lions got bent over and emboweled by the refs, but who cares? Because when it mattered most, Matthew Stafford locked in and led the Lions to a touchdown drive, leading the game 16-15. Then the Lions defense folded a little bit, but the Ravens were forced to attempt a 61-yard field goal, a kick that maybe one guy in the history of man can make, and yeah, the guy I'm talking about is Justin Tucker. He's the guy that can make the kick, and he was the guy who was going to kick it too, and he knocked down the kick by centimeters. And Matthew Stafford threw another pick, and Justin Tucker and the Ravens knocked off the Lions and effectively eliminated them from the playoffs. And there's going to be more Justin Tucker later on. Absolute blown opportunity. If they got either one of those games versus the Bucs and the Ravens, the division would have been theirs, with the Packers taking the division in reality with just 8 wins. And so Jim Schwartz paid the price, as the man was fired and a new coaching staff was brought in, led by Jim Caldwell at head coach, offensive coordinator Joe Lombardi, I don't know, I guess a quarterback's coach in Jim Bob Cooter, who will later become the offensive coordinator. And that guy Jim Bob that I was talking about, he has some spicy lore behind him. Lions shenanigans aside, the 2014 campaign turned out to be the Lions' most successful one of the Matthew Stafford era. They won 11 games and honestly had a pretty balanced team overall. Matthew Stafford finally made a Pro Bowl, and joining him, as per usual, was Calvin Johnson, but now new wide receiver Golden Tate was here too, even outgaining Calvin Johnson in terms of yardage. And the thing is, the offense, led by 2 Pro Bowlers and Calvin Johnson on it, was actually not even the strength of this Lions team. The defense for the Detroit Lions was a thing of beauty in 2014. The pass defense was cool. Glover Quinn and Darius Slay made plays when needed, but their run defense was simply one of the greatest single-season units ever. DeAndre Levy, the Lions' veteran linebacker, paired with Ndamukong Suh, and they somehow just merged together and formed a cement barricade. Teams only averaged 65.2 yards per game on the ground versus Detroit. And for reference on how nuts that is, the team that ran for the least amount of yards per game in 2014 was the Raiders, and they ran for 77.5 yards per game. So, on average, when teams ran the ball against the Lions, they were worse than the Raiders. And that is really saying something. The run defense would also have probably been even more dominant if Stephen Tulloch didn't tear his ACL celebrating a sack. But, it happens. And now it was playoff time again for the Detroit Lions? The playoffs? Hold on a minute. Are they actually allowed to do this? Is happiness like a feasible concept for their fans to achieve? Well, okay, hold on. Look, before we overreact and grab a bottle of lotion, let's look at what stood in Detroit's way in the playoffs, because they actually did make the playoffs this year, and the team that would be waiting for them was the Dallas Cowboys, who would host the game, and they were pretty good too. Tony Romo, DeMarco Murray, and Des Bryant were all in their prime, but the Lions just matched up versus them pretty well on paper. Stafford just gets it done versus Dallas for some reason, and since 2011, Detroit didn't lose a single game versus the Cowboys, dropping 30-plus points on them in both games. So, although they were the underdogs, this game was definitely going to come down to the wire regardless. So, it was time for Lions versus Cowboys, a matchup between the NFL's most popular team and the Lions. Yeah, Let's bring out another one of these bad boys. A graph of some sort to attempt to visualize for you how the Lions managed to lose this game. Because, spoilers, they didn't win, and we got some pain to get into. Let's hop in late in the second quarter, where the Lions were in full control of the game and held a 14-0 lead after Golden Tate and Reggie Bush touchdowns. Seriously, there was no debate as to what team was landing all the haymakers, but the first moment of failure came when Tony Romo was brought down by Darryl Tapp and the ball came loose and the Cowboys recovered almost immediately, cheating the Lions out of great field position. Then we move on to, I guess, a more innocent moment where the Lions basically just ruined an entire drive and a chance to at least burn clock with a false start and delay of game back-to-back, which, you know, it is what it is, but then the first real threat of reality grabbed a hold of Lions fans when cornerback Cassius Vaughn's ass ended up on the green and Terrence Williams ran for a 76-yard touchdown, and all of a sudden, we got ourselves a game. So that was a total disaster, but the Lions were set to start with the ball in the third quarter, so, you know, as long as they got a long drive going that at least stalled the momentum and Stafford's pass got tipped and then picked off. Okay. Sick. The only silver-ish lining was that the Cowboys then missed the field goal, but when Detroit got the ball back, overly conservative play calling forced that drive to only end in 3 points despite the field position, so shout out to Joe Lombardi for that one, and then the bus really started to fall off the wheels. Somehow, someway, DeAndre Levy, a linebacker, found himself guarding Dez Bryant. And that actually ended up going, I guess, better than you probably expected. And after a holding penalty on the Cowboys, on 4th down and 1, the Lions had a chance to make a game-changing stop. All they needed was their all-time great run defense, the strongest part of the team to empty out their energy tank for 2 seconds. But instead, DeMarco Murray was only maybe touched by a singular dude's arm hair, and now all the alarms were going off. Fast forward a defensive stop later from Dallas and a few missed holdings drawn by Ndamukong Suh, and Matthew Stafford and company were set to make something happen, but return man Jeremy Ross did not make it easy, taking the ball all the way out of the end zone to the 5-yard line, where the Lions would set up shop. But remember this team is super talented, and Matthew Stafford is very good, and so is Calvin Johnson, so they dug themselves out of that man-made hole, and now it's time for the play. You know which one I'm talking about. I'll give you a few seconds to leave the room if you so choose to, Lions fans, because this is going to sting. All right, you ready? 8 minutes and 26 seconds left in the fourth quarter. 3rd down and 1. Matthew Stafford launches a 20-yard pass to tight end Brandon Pettigrew, and a flag for clear face guarding was thrown. And with that, all hell broke loose. It just immediately, for reasons that I can't even begin to understand, Dez Bryant comes sprinting onto the field having taken off his helmet, which by rule is illegal, and if that wasn't bad enough, the ref said, you know what, not only are we not going to flag Dez Bryant, but fuck you, we're picking up the flag too. The play was totally clean, and Anthony Hitchens' movements had nothing to do with pass interference or holding. And as if that wasn't bad enough, in all the confusion, the refs proceeded to call a delay of game penalty on the Lions, backing them up 5 yards. And as if that wasn't bad enough too, Lions punter Sam Martin came out for the punt of his life and kicked the brown object an astonishing 10 yards. 10 yards! My God, what is even happening anymore? But wait, there's more, because although the Anthony Hitchens penalty being picked up gets all the attention, honestly, this next no call was so much more devastating. On 4th down and 6, a literal play that would decide the game, Tony Romo drops back and connects with Jason Witten for an eventual game-altering play. But hold on, if we run this tape back real quick and observe one Ndamukong Suh to see what was going on with him on this seemingly unsuspecting play, I mean, bruh, you be the judge here, okay? Do you see holding? I don't even need to say anything else, right? I mean, Jesus Christ, dude. This was just a masterclass from the Zebras in how to raise Detroit's suicide rates in a matter of minutes. And at this point, the avalanche of misfortune just could not be contained. A few plays later, after getting new life from, guess what, a penalty, on 3rd and goal, Tony Romo connected with Terrence Williams for a game-winning touchdown, and then all that was left to do was one more play, one more stop from Dallas, and the game was over. And after fumbling himself, DeMarcus Lawrence got a walk-off sack, And wow, have you ever seen a more agonizing playoff loss than that? So, while all fans joined together to laugh at Detroit once again, for true Lions fans out there, the few and passionate, this was no joke. This was torture. How could someone play with their happiness so heartlessly, openly f***ing them in front of the globe, and stealing even a chance at a singular playoff win, something they've still yet to taste since 1991, and instead of, denying the fact that the NFL was favoring one team, which they've tended to do in the past, after the game, they had the sheer gall to apologize for the terrible officiating, pointing out several plays throughout the game that shouldn't have been called the way they were. And most notably, the Anthony Hitchens flag that was picked up and the no-call holding on Sue on 4th and 6 when the Cowboys converted were both confirmed by the NFL themselves to be botched calls by the refs. Great. Fabulous. So, despite the very heartfelt apology from Roger, that didn't change the fact that the Lions were forced to watch the Cowboys get arguably screwed over from their couch. And then, to make things even better, the 2015 campaign would turn out to be an S-tier Lions season. In a bad way. I'm basing this on how entertaining it was for the rest of us to see Lions fans suffer. And, boy, was there suffering this year, because the Lions' uncharacteristically unbendable defense a year prior reverted right back to being one of the worst in the NFL. And why was that, you may be asking? Well, maybe it had something to do with the fact that they let this thing leave. And yes, they actually let him walk in free agency. Details are still somewhat murky on this subject, but essentially the Dolphins and Lions offered similar amounts of money. However, Sue felt as if the Lions just didn't value him as much as they should have, and the man took his talents to South Beach, leaving behind a defense that was giving up 30.6 points per game through the first 8 weeks of 2015. 30 points a game, where, coincidentally, the Lions found themselves with a 1-7 record, and ended up firing Martin Mayhew, the GM, because of that, and despite winning 6 out of their next 7 games, didn't matter, their season was all but over, and the Lions missed the playoffs. Overall, really just another season to try their best to forget for Lions fans. Hail Mary by Aaron Rodgers? What are you talking about? That never happened. What face mask? The NFL apologizing again for a game-changing no-call versus the Legion of Boom? What? No, surely not against the Lions. Good to see the NFL apologizing again, though. And Detroit now went into 2016 with a new general manager in Bob Quinn and kept Jim Caldwell around. He wasn't the sexiest NFL head coach, but he did keep the ship afloat after their early season collapse, so maybe he was more valuable than initially believed. A lesson that unfortunately the Lions will learn the hard way in a few seasons. So the 2016 season began, and wait a minute. Where's Calvin Johnson? He's not on the field. That says 80, not 81. Where the hell is he? Well, at this point, it's important to realize that Lions fans felt like this cycle of endless torment of first-round mediocrity at absolute best was never going to end, so happiness was a fleeting emotion at best. But they would soon come face-to-face with full, fleshed-out depression when Calvin Johnson, arguably the best player in their entire franchise history and the clear best of the past 10 years, announced his retirement even before the summer of 2016 began. The reasons for his retirement have varied heavily. The injuries for the Hall of Famer had exponentially gotten worse. He had several contract problems, including the Lions forcing him to pay back parts of his contract, and according to Tron himself, he actually wanted to keep playing, but for another team, and the Lions wouldn't let him, possibly because of a massive dead cap hit. But regardless of reasons, Matthew Stafford and Calvin Johnson, the only consistent thing about the Detroit Lions over the last 6 years, was no more, and surely only dark times lied ahead. And it looked like the cave would only just get dimmer and dimmer, as just like in 2012, the Lions found themselves sitting at a 4-4 record, despite having one of the easiest schedules in the league, and fell to the sex icon Brock Osweiler. And they now had 2 paths laid out ahead of them. Repeat history or succeed. Wait, are they even allowed to do that? Should I put this on here? All right, well, fuck it. Let's roll. So, from weeks 9 through 14, they actually chose the correct path, and everything was coming up Lions. The defense led by Glover Quinn and Darius Slay had tapped into the matrix, holding all 5 opponents to under 20 points, and Matthew Stafford took care of the rest. And at 9-4, and with the Packers and Vikings at 7-6, and the Bears doing, well, the Bears things, the Lions were the clear favorites to win the division and host a playoff game, which would just be unprecedented for this era of Detroit, obviously. So the football gods saw this blue storm brewing, and as it was said, could Lions fans have a fun January? Hell no, they said, and that's how it was written. And just like that, the gods had made their decision, and Matthew Stafford basically just broke his finger. And for the remainder of the 2016 season, he clearly wasn't the same quarterback. He was still slinging it, because Stafford is a goddamn trooper, but his efficiency was way off, and betting that Stafford would throw an interception in a game was all but a guarantee. And so, impressively, Lions fans had to watch in absolute disbelief as this abomination of a franchise lost all 3 remaining games in the regular season, while Aaron Rodgers and the Packers ran the table. They actually did what they said they were going to do and stole the division, sending the injured Detroit Lions into the playoffs, except they weren't hosting a playoff game, and instead they had to travel to Seattle to a date with death. Now, I'm not saying they had no chance in this game because Seattle was this steamroller going through everyone, but more because of what the Lions were looking like at this point in the season, because Stafford's injury and the defense playing horribly weren't helping, and then when you add on a few questionable calls and some bizarre catches, that's how you get a game that was never really close, and the Lions lost yet another wildcard playoff game, 26-6. Now, this wasn't a great position to be in, but surely it can't get worse, right? I mean, all they needed was a spark player in the draft, maybe, to add something to the team, and although they drafted Taylor Decker last year in the first round, who will prove to be an integral piece to their resurrection, their first round pick in 2017 was linebacker Jared Davis, who is out of the NFL. Luckily, they did save their draft by getting Kenny Golladay in the 3rd round, but they still needed a dog in free agency, and luckily, that is exactly what they got. This is Darren Fells. Yeah, I lied. There was a total lack of dog in free agency for the Lions, but luckily, talent still existed on the roster from the previous regime. Just not enough, though, because Darius Slay was an all-pro and Matthew Stafford had another underrated season, but despite their efforts, the same shit was just happening again. Let me take you to just week 3 of the 2017 season, where things were just going peachy for the Lions. Stafford, through 2 weeks, had been arguably the most efficient quarterback in football, and going into a matchup with the defending NFC champion, not Super Bowl champion Atlanta Falcons, they had a real shot at making themselves feared around the league with a win. And thus began one of the Detroit Lion games of all time. As of right now, although these games may seem inconsequential, trust me, they add up over time and all get thrown into this bubbling cauldron of pain. So, late in the game, the Lions needed exactly one more Matthew Stafford drive to take the lead, and after the defense led by Glover Quinn and Darius Slay gave him a chance, Stafford did his thing, and the Lions actually got inside the 1 through a penalty. Yeah, they actually can get those from time to time, and then Golden Tate got a touchdown to win the game. But come on now, we've already been together for 30 minutes, and you should already know that this arc is not going to have a happy ending. And after further review, Golden Tate was touchdown just barely before getting into the end zone. And by a technicality, because the Lions had no more timeouts, there was a 10-second runoff, and that was the game. It's only the Lions, man. I'm telling you. Regardless, Detroit kept moving forward and got themselves back into the playoff hunt after handling some terrible football teams, and all they had to do was take care of the 5-win Bengals on the road. But although these Cincinnati Bengals were bad, like Marvin Lewis bad, this Bengals team turned out to be one of the best playoff killers of all time, as they took down the Lions 26-17 in a massive upset, and then ruined the Ravens season 1 week later. And that was it. That's the end of another era in Detroit, as days after week 17, Jim Caldwell was fired, and now it was crucial that the Lions got the perfect coach to capitalize on the talent they had on the roster. Stafford, Darius Slay, and the emerging Quandre Diggs were just a few of the names to take advantage of, and so the coaching search began. And unfortunately, they knew what guy they wanted all along, and in came one of the many apprentices to the Dark Warlock, Matt Patricia, who was basically hired on January 14th, 2018. However, before we go any further, I gotta talk to you about this video sponsor, Underdog Fantasy. If you've been around this channel for a hot minute, you already know what I'm about to say, but Underdog Fantasy, if you're somehow not familiar, is the easiest way to play fantasy sports in my opinion, and my personal favorite way to do that is through the pick'em game format, where all you do is choose whether you think a player will go higher or lower on a singular stat, and depending on how many you get right, you can win up to 20 times your initial money. And for the final time for the Super Bowl, my two picks are Isaiah Pacheco over 65.5 rushing yards, and Brandon Ayuk under 10.95 half PPR fantasy points. So, if you want to tail this pick'em entry or come up with your own and you live in one of these many states in orange on the screen here, then click the link in the description to sign up with promo code TubFrog and Underdog will match your first deposit of up to $100. Also, if you've never used my code before, then when you use it for the first time, this week you'll get a free Patrick Mahomes square where all he's going to have to do is throw for half a yard and you get that freebie. So, if that sounds good to you, then go have fun at Underdog and use promo code TubFrog for a massive discount. And with that, it's time for more Lions pain. Let's get back to it. Now, this was sort of a weird decision to announce so early, because at the time, Matt Patricia was still the defensive coordinator for the Patriots, who had an AFC championship and an eventual Super Bowl to play and lose in. So, while still on the Patriots staff, Matt Patricia already started to call some shots, informing multiple assistants from the Lions that they're out and his crew will be taking their spots. Except for Jim Bob Cooter. He's still very horny, but I guess he can call an offense pretty well. Now, with Matt Patricia now mentoring Matthew Stafford, driving around on his moped, Matt now took over a Lions team that has proven to be one of the most consistently average teams overall, and with that, expectations were also, pretty average. They also added almost nobody again in free agency, but they did draft Frank Ragnow in the first round and Kerryon Johnson in the second round. Both very impactful players. They actually won a lot more than the other, but still, they did things. And it was now time to set the tone for the Matt Patricia era in Detroit. And in week 1, the Lions got a dream matchup versus a rookie Sam Darnold. And Sam Darnold is not a very good football player, but in this game versus the Jets, the Lions and Matt Patricia got embarrassed. It was time for the football gods to step in yet again and grant all Lions fans with a little grim foreshadowing, because Matt Patricia has no idea how to command leadership, and maybe in a pool of his own ooze, Patricia was dragging down Stafford with him, cause this graphic doesn't paint Matthew Stafford in a positive light whatsoever, as he got decisively outplayed by a pre-spirit-seeing Sam Darnold, and the Lions got annihilated by the Jets. And so, the tone was set for the season in just the first week, but in week 3 versus the Patriots on Sunday Night Football, Matt Patricia traded in all the potential success he could have for just one sweet victory versus his former team. And for the first time, basically ever, Matthew Stafford got the pressure taken off of him and the Lions established the run. Rookie Kerryon Johnson became the first 100-yard rusher since 2013 that they've had, and Detroit seemingly revived their season at the time, beating the Evil Empire 26-10. Now, that was pretty great, I'll give him that, but pretty much immediately after that game, the Lions went right back to lioning, but in a new way, because previously under Jim Caldwell, they had become senseis of being average or forgettable at best, but under Matt Patricia, in came a new era of just being plain f***ing shit. But they still stayed true to some of their old ways, blowing a Matthew Stafford game-winning drive opportunity in a loss to Dallas, and then because of his efforts, they promptly rewarded the man by allowing him to get sacked 10 times in a blowout loss versus the Vikings. And while this clown show was on full display on the turf, the ringleader was making a fool of himself in every possible facet of life, giving lectures to reporters about their posture during press conferences like he's a 5th grade teacher, and if that one clip alone doesn't tell you what type of hooligan we're dealing with, I mean, dude, this actually happened. And this video's mere existence gets so much worse with the context that the Lions were actively practicing in the snow when their next 4 games in a row were all going to be played indoors. The season was just a smoldering shipwreck from every angle. They ended the season only winning 3 of their last 10 games, and year 1 under the defensive-oriented Matt Patricia was headlined by his loss of the locker room already, repeatedly showing up late to his own meetings, and to top everything off, despite still having Glover Quinn, Quandre Diggs, and Darius Slay in their primes, the defense damn near allowed more points than they did in the previous previous season. The 2019 season then brought more of the same misery. They added another piece in the draft with TJ Hawkinson, and then because Matt Patricia and every Bill Belichick disciple has a chronic condition to feel a need to bring in old Patriots, in came Trey Flowers, who did very little for Detroit, and Danny Amendola, who was, actually pretty solid for them. But you get the point. And then for the first 8 games of the season, everything was crumbling around the Lions. Literally everything, except for one man. Matthew Stafford was quietly having one of the best starts to a season in the NFL, putting up these stats on ridiculous efficiency with no run game as per usual, and he had the Lions sitting at a 3-4-1 record after a Week 9 loss to the Raiders. But in that game versus Oakland, which, I had a good time at, I'm not really sure Matthew Stafford did, because although he had another masterful game, Stafford ended up fracturing multiple bones in his back, which eventually would land him on injured reserve for the rest of the season. Okay, this is bad, but at least now that Matthew Stafford is down and out, we can truly see how valuable he is to the team. And although everyone had always said he was just this quarterback overflowing with talent, shackled to pay for the sins of the organization that imprisoned him, it was now time to put that to the test. And so, without Matthew Stafford, Matt Patricia and the Detroit Lions lost every game left on their schedule. They lost every single game without Matthew Stafford, losing all 8 to end the season, and finished the year winning just 3 games total. But wait, we're not done with this year yet, because in the middle of the season, allegedly influenced by the bearded himself, Quandre Diggs was traded away to the Seahawks for just a 5th-round pick, which would later be used to draft running back Jason Huntley. So they basically just cut one of their best players in his prime, and he still had a ton left in the tank too, going on to make 3 straight Pro Bowls with the Seahawks. Now, why would the Lions do this? Well, according to Quandre himself, him being traded was the result of a simple power struggle where general manager Bob Quinn and obviously Matt Patricia wanted more control over the locker room, and getting rid of their team captains would help that, I guess. Okay, and then because the wound was only a flesh cut at this point, in came supervillain Bob Quinn to spear Lions fans through the heart and more when in the offseason they shipped off Darius Slay to the Eagles. And same as Quandre, the reasons for that happening had to do with Matt Patricia. In the aftermath, Darius Slay told the media that Patricia just generally didn't respect his game, and then took things a little too far one day when he basically made fun of him for getting balls caught on him during practice, and then accused him of getting more balls caught on him by another wide receiver. Literally telling a full-grown man to stop meat-riding another wide receiver just because of an Instagram picture he posted where all he was doing was guarding Odell Beckham. And trust me, I looked at it. There's nothing buttery going on. So that happened, but let's take a wide view of things just for a second, okay? As of the beginning of the 2020 season, Matt Patricia had a record of 9-22-1, and all he's proven so far is that he has the ability to whittle a mid-team all the way down to a laughingstock. So now the 2020 season would be a make-or-break year for not just Matt Patricia, but this entire coaching staff, general manager Bob Quinn included, and you know the drill. It was another offseason of big-name free agents, with Hall of Fame running back Adrian Peterson coming to Detroit, Everson Griffin in a trade later on, and former Patriot Jamie Collins, all at the age of 31 at least. The best age for football players. And then DeAndre Swift and Jonah Jackson did help in the draft, but the bright spots on this roster were, and I'm being generous here when I say few and far between. This roster was looking bleak. But before we move on, I gotta mention 2 things that are gonna be very important later on. So just keep this in mind. Before this season, the Lions transferred ownership to Sheila Ford, which would just be massive, and a little-known assistant named Ben Johnson would be promoted to the tight ends coach. So once again, please remember these moves later on. But whatever. Give Matthew Stafford a 40-year-old Adrian Peterson if you want. He's seen worse. And with weapons like Kenny Golladay, TJ Hawkinson, and, I guess Danny Amendola, he can still make first team all underrated. And Matty also knew how important it was to come out firing right out of the gate, because so far under Patricia, both of their seasons literally ended in week 1. So it was imperative to not just throw away another season instantly. Please, Detroit, for 1 year, can you make your season mildly interesting past week 1? Now, this will be a happy video eventually, but I never said it was going to be that way during the entire ride. And, the darkness just didn't go away. In week 1, the Lions held an insurmountable 23-6 lead versus Mitchell Trubisky's Bears and actually found a way to lose, doinking a 55-yard field goal off of the crossbar, and then DeAndre Swift dropped a game-winning touchdown. Why do they keep doing this? For Matt Patricia's entire coaching career as the Lions head coach so far, he's maybe turned this franchise into the worst tone setter in the history of man, and now Lions fans were forced to watch another season where it basically just felt like they were strapped to the back of a rocket and fired into the sun, because there is no fun in watching a team that has zero future and zero present. And for the third year in a row, this team was just going nowhere. And the only thing they really had to look forward to was Matt Patricia and Bob Quinn hopefully being fired by the season's end, because even that wasn't a guarantee at this point, to be honest with you. So yeah, the Lions just kept losing, and they also lost Kenny Golladay in Week 8 to an injury that would hold him out for the rest of the year, and as time would reveal, Kenny Golladay would never play another game for the Detroit Lions again. So there goes Calvin Johnson 1.4, I guess, but Lions fans could accept that as a necessary sacrifice for what was to come. Much like the ancient Aztecs, the Lions knew they needed to appease the football gods with a blood sacrifice. And if we want to be really superstitious, I could bring up the Bobby Lane curse that I mentioned a little bit in the intro, but we'll get there in a few minutes. For now, with Kenny Golladay and others injured, it was enough. The gods smiled upon Detroit, and after not seeing any results for damn near 3 years, Matt Patricia was out as head coach, and Bob Quinn was out as GM after they got fisted 41-25 on Thanksgiving, as is tradition. But this was no time to be sad, because although they just got destroyed, there was hope for a better future in Detroit. Rejoice, my brothers and sisters. The fuck-ass bearded gremlin and his trusted buddy Bob Quinn were gone, and immediately everyone started shitting all over Matt Patricia, like almost instantly. Ex-Lions players started coming out anonymously and saying the dude was just a complete imposter. He just wasn't approachable in the building and pretended to be someone he wasn't. And honestly, I could go on and on discussing all the X's and O's as to why he failed, because there's a lot of that, but the truth is, Matt Patricia just suffered from Bill Belichick-itis, which in the dictionary of the NFL means he tried to establish Patriots culture in another spot outside of New England, and as pretty much has happened every single time when someone tries to do that, it obviously failed. Now, this is just my opinion, and believe it or not, I wasn't actually in the Lions locker room when Matt Patricia was there, but I feel like when he came into the facility in like the first day, he sort of just felt like he already won over all the players and coaches' respects just by being a byproduct of the Patriots dynasty, but you know, that's not how respect works in the NFL. And instead, although he didn't have any respect, he tried to get it, which didn't work. And what resulted was a complete culture change from one of mediocrity to boring, uninspired, soulless, and just plain comical football. And trust me, I would know. I'm also a victim of the Bill Belichick acolytes. So now all eyes turn to Sheila Ford. Could she do what her other family members couldn't and actually hire a competent general manager and head coach? Well, only time would tell, but within a week apart, the Lions hired former tight end and interim head coach Dan Campbell to be the new head coach and Brad Holmes to be the new executive vice president and general manager. And with that, the Lions' future would be changed forever. That move was massive, let's not understate that, but a new era was truly brought in on January 30th, where just 2 weeks after Holmes was given the job, Matthew Stafford, pretty much the only consistent thing about this entire video for a decade plus, was set to be traded to the Los Angeles Rams for multiple first-round picks and Jared Goff. And now, officially, with Matthew Stafford gone, a new era had begun in Detroit. It was time for creativity to bloom, because the Lions just had a blank canvas to work with. The Matthew Stafford, Calvin Johnson era of averageness was extinct, and the Matthew Stafford, Matt Patricia era also disintegrated, and now, with the keys of the organization placed in the hands of Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes, the 2021 NFL Draft was not only going to be important for the future of the team, but if these guys were going to keep their jobs by 2023, they needed to land one cornerstone for the future at least, and man, I'm so jealous about what they did with this draft class. They just had one of the best draft classes in recent history, and I'm pissed off about it. It's not fair? How come they get this and we get Alex Leatherwood and Tyree Wilson? And, sorry, let the Raiders fan leak out there, but the point is I'm just so jealous. And in the first round, the Lions selected the Oregon Wall himself with offensive tackle Penei Sewell, one of the most hyped up linemen in NFL history, 7th overall. And even though Sewell was drafted over guys like Micah Parsons and Patrick Surtain, trust me, there is no doubt in my mind that if the Lions could do this pick over, absolutely nothing would change. Admittedly, the Lions' second-round pick, Levi Onwuzurike, has been underwhelming, if not just plain so far, but to be fair, he has been dealing with a lot of injuries, so it's still a little too early to judge him, but just listen to this, dude. Here were the next 4 guys drafted by the Lions, okay? Aleem McNeil, the 7th highest rated defensive tackle in football, just behind Chris Jones. Afatu Melifonwu, who as of the recording of this video, very recently earned the starting safety job and instantly became one of the best safeties in the league. Defensive end Derek Barnes, who the Lions received in a draft trade, who will get a game-clinching interception later on. And finally, the magnum opus of this draft in terms of value per round and just overall talent, with Amon-Ra St. Brown, a future all-pro wide receiver and Jared Goff's new best friend. What a fucking draft to start your career out with. Obviously, the entire Lions coaching staff that contributed to the scouting department deserves credit too, but Brad Holmes just made it look like he was doing a Madden rebuild. He went from 18 years working with the Rams to this, and Brad Holmes did gradually work his way up the NFL ladder, and just like Sheila Ford and Dan Campbell, they all seem to share the same mentality. A mentality of being an underdog and just overall toughness, an identity that the entire city of Detroit will very soon embody. Dan Campbell also knew how damaged the Lions were as a franchise, and that was one of the main points during his famous kneecap biting speech, but nobody really cared unless he went out there and proved it behind a real football team. And once the 2021 season began, it was a rebirth. Truly, a miracle of greater power as the Lions had their first winning season. Sorry, that's my bad. I jumped the gun a little bit. We are not there yet. And instead what happened was one of the worst starts to any rookie head coach's career ever, as the Detroit Lions went right back to being the laughingstock of the NFL, starting the season out 0-10-1, and people were seriously pushing for Dan Campbell to be fired immediately after the season concluded, and one of the reasons for that whole narrative being pushed was, of course, the Lions remaining loyal to their ancestors' customs of choking to this scary extent this season. In just week 3, the first win of the Dan Campbell era was taken away from them by the toes of Justin Tucker, and a tip-in NFL record 66-yard field goal of the fucking crossbar, but besides that, it was the usual heartbreaking one-possession losses that they had gotten used to at this point. They got another one snatched away from them by Minnesota, but things truly were at the lowest point for the Lions since way back in probably 2019 when the Lions got groped 44-6 by the Eagles at home, who weren't a very good team. And more, it seemed like Dan Campbell's speeches about old-school punches and kneecaps and biting and ass wiping were all just a mask to keep his job for another year. However, unlike other Lions teams in the past that just lied down and waited for nature to take its course, they realized the Lions are the apex predators of their ecosystem, and, we can try to replicate that here, maybe. And in the final 6 weeks of the season, the Lions actually broke even with a .500 record at 3-3, so maybe there was hope with this coaching staff, but the talent on the roster had some unanswered questions to deal with in the offseason, and I said questions, but there really was just one main one. Their quarterback was Jared Goff, and that had to change. Jared Goff, in his first season in Detroit, had the worst season of his entire career, starting a majority of the season, as his stats were down across the board, and to really fuck with Lions fans, they had to watch in either pleasure, sadness, or jealousy, as Matthew Stafford, in just his first year as a Los Angeles Ram, won a Super Bowl. And now more than ever, the talks about the Lions never even sniffing a Super Bowl in their entire franchise's existence were at their absolute peaks. And without a quarterback or any true star on defense, that sure as hell was not going to change if this all kept up. The plan seemed to be obvious for Detroit, though. Goff would hold the starting quarterback job for the next year or two at absolute most, and eventually the Lions will draft a quarterback to grow alongside the other guys and someone that'll at least fit their timetable. But in the 2022 NFL Draft, the Lions did not draft a quarterback. So although damn near every report coming out about Jared Goff was either completely negative or neutral at best, it looked like Lions fans were going to be subjected to another year of Jared Goff football with no hope for the future. Truly the game of football at its absolute peak entertainment levels. But hold on, let's just go back for a second, because I did just mention the 2022 Lions draft class, so let's look back on it already. I know it's way too early, but even in just barely 2 seasons as of the production of this video, it looks like overall, Brett Holmes smashed it again. James Houston has barely played, but when he's been on the field, all the dude did was record 8 sacks in 7 games in 2022, and then you got other guys like Kirby Joseph, a consistent defensive starter, and first-round pick Jamison Williams, who is a bit more complicated than the other guys due to his suspensions and injuries, but there's no denying that there is talent there, and he's better than Josh Reynolds. I think, because the dude can't catch. But this is also all ignoring the second overall pick in the 2022 NFL Draft. Defensive end, Aiden Hutchinson, the hometown hero, born and raised in Michigan, played for Michigan in college, and now was a Detroit Lion. And on paper, at least, he seemed like the perfect Dan Campbell type player. And eventually, he will blossom into arguably one of the most impactful defensive edge rushers in the sport. So before the season, the Lions brought in a few somewhat impactful free agents. Very impactful if you're trying to compare these to the past free agent signings they've had. But they brought in DJ Chark and Josh Reynolds. But the general public was still unimpressed by these signings, and most predicted the Lions might not even improve from their previous 3-win season. But one promotion, in a way, went completely under the radar in the offseason, and that was the promotion of tight ends coach Ben Johnson to the offensive coordinator. And with Ben now getting the OC job, for the first time, the Lions' offense could be described as good and fun. Now, like I said, Jared Goff was considered a bottom 10 to 5 starting quarterback at this time, but there was a time where he was a Pro Bowl level player under Sean McVay. So Ben Johnson took elements from his time with the Rams and infused that with some new creative ideas that he had to truly make a top tier offense, which was, pretty cool. But for me, what Ben Johnson did best is what most head coaches actually fail to do, which is so simple, and that's maximize the talent that the Lions had on the roster. Rather than forcing a style down their throats, Ben Johnson looked at the offensive line, led by Frank Ragnow, Taylor Decker, Penei Sewell, and Jonah Jackson, and decided to utilize zone run schemes, a staple of the modern NFL, which is nothing crazy, but also, Ben Johnson recognized how rare of a human being Penei Sewell is, and had the guy go in motion multiple times throughout the season, and by year's end, Penei Sewell ended up pulling at one of the highest rates of any tackle in football. And with that, it was time for the 2022 Lions season to start. And God damn it, man. Even when all the pieces are there to at least be a fun mid-team, through week 8, the Lions were 1-6. And we're losing again. Headlined by another wedgie from a not amazing team in the Patriots, and the accusations of being a fraud were still being targeted at Dan Campbell, but now even Brad Holmes decided to catch some strays. And if this rebuild didn't start showing any signs of life soon, both of those dudes were going to find themselves around the guillotine any day now. But when all hope seemed lost, in came week 9, when the Green Bay Packers would come to Detroit. And although they were also struggling at the time trying to turn their season around, the Packers were still slightly favored. But these two teams were very evenly matched, despite the win total difference. And the game itself would prove to be massive in terms of playoff seeding down the line, but we'll get there when we get there. So the game between the Lions and Packers would begin, and after a 60-minute duel, the Packers fell 15-9. And shockingly, the Lions picked off Aaron Rodgers 3 times, ruining multiple red zone opportunities, and just like that, the switch was flipped, and the Detroit Lions culture, underdog mentality, and overall ruggedness had finally begun to blossom. But the funny thing is, actually, many people sort of expected the complete opposite thing to happen before this game. Because days before the Packers matchup, the Lions traded away TJ Hawkinson to the Vikings for a few picks, and he was obviously a massive part of the offense, and you can't just replace a top 5 tight end mid-season in terms of actual play on the field, but also, anytime a rising star gets traded, there's always going to be some uncertainty in the locker room from each guy, basically wondering, am I next up on the trading block? But that did not happen, and the Lions moved forward, and from weeks 9 through 17, they were simply one of the best teams in the NFL. Let me say that again. Lions fans were watching a football team that could be considered dangerous by others. And in that 10-week sample size, the Lions only lost 2 games, including a Thanksgiving nail-biter versus a perceived Super Bowl contender in the Bills, and heading into Week 17, the city of Detroit was just overflowing with life. To get to this point so quickly, it wasn't just the genius play calling of Ben Johnson, Sheila Ford's leadership, or Dan Campbell's whole personality thing. It was a combination of all of that and all the young guys and players on the field doing what they had to do. And, you know, with this culture being reborn, what better way to cement the Lions' resurrection than in Week 17, when the Detroit Lions would travel to Lambeau Field and play the Green Bay Packers with a playoff spot on the line. But unfortunately for the Lions, the Seahawks ended up taking their playoff spot away from them, so they were already eliminated, but not the Packers. And instead, this game would basically just be a test to see how hungry the Lions would play, even though they didn't have anything to play for. And what happened was, it was beautiful. Everyone ended up being 100% sold on the Lions coaching staff and the new regime after this game, because even though the Lions had nothing on the line, they just outplayed them. And although the Packers did fight, the Lions just made too many plays, and Kirby Joseph intercepted Aaron Rodgers' last pass ever as a Packer, and on 4th down, Dan Campbell, the man who went for it on 4th down more than all but 2 other teams in 2022, said it and rolled the dice to win the game on 4th down and 1, and DJ Chark iced it for Detroit as the Lions eliminated the Packers from the playoffs, finishing the year 9-8. So yeah, the Lions were a whole new team, but fuck all the Dan Campbell culture stuff, Brad Holmes being smart, Ben Johnson's X's and O's, and the players just being overall good, because the only reason the Lions were a competent team again was because Peyton Manning filled the bathtub with some whiskey and lifted the Bobby Lane curse. And if you're not familiar, I'll just break it down real quick, but the Bobby Lane curse basically originated when the Lions traded their superstar quarterback, Bobby Lane, after winning an NFL championship with him, and the man said something along the lines of, "The Lions will not win a game for 50 years" on his way out. And, well, what do you know, on the 50th anniversary of him saying that, the Lions had their infamous 2008 winless season, or at least that's how it is written. But luckily, the cranium siphoned the soul of Lane, and after the 2022 season, the Lions felt like a new team. Although they did miss the playoffs, it felt like a weight had just been lifted off their shoulders, and the Lions turned towards the 2023 NFL draft to add more talent to this delectable sauce that had been years in the making. And once again, it's way too early to judge these guys after literally 1 season, but as of right now, it's looking like Jack Campbell might be a bit of a miss, but there are other 3 guys, dude. I mean, it's not even a little bit fair. How do they keep getting these dudes? But you know what? I can't really be that mad, because that's what makes Brad Holmes so successful. At first, they found replacements for DeAndre Swift, who left to Philadelphia, and TJ Hawkinson, with Sam Laporta and Jahmyr Gibbs, who will grow to be Pro Bowl level players. And then Brian Branch, a 2nd-round pick who they drafted, just casually became one of the best rookie corners in the league. So all of this was just great, right? I mean, it was awesome. For the first time, the Detroit Lions were going to be a great team, right? But I mean, this is what makes football so much fun, right? It's just like the Chargers. Although all the pieces are there, this is the Lions after all. They've done this time and time again, where even if they have a good roster, they're loyal to the ancient rules of football. And they're just going to go out there and shit themselves, right? Right? Well, in just week 1, the Lions, in front of pretty much the entire world, took down the defending Super Bowl champion Chiefs, and headlined by another wheelbarrow nut-holding 4th down call by Dan Campbell, the Detroit Lions were introduced to the mainstream of the NFL world, if they weren't already. Just like that, Lions fans, who looked like they were bordering on extinction in 2020, were now a plentiful species, and following a red-hot 8-2 start, a playoff home game for the first time in over 30 years seemed possible and, dare I say, likely. But hold on, that was still so far away, and after a lucky win versus the Bears, the Lions began to scare people a little bit, because they were still the Lions, so, you know, you never know what's going to happen next. And they did have one more controversy before the end of the season in Dallas, but it really didn't matter in the grand scheme of things, because after Week 18, the Lions finished the season with a 12-5 record, tying their highest win season ever. And for the first time since 1991, the Detroit Lions were going to host a playoff game. Led by Dan Campbell, Jared Goff, who's good now, and other young dudes, they had a chance to win a playoff game too. And The team they would be going up against would be the Los Angeles Rams, led by one singular quarterback who stood in their way, and you already know what guy it is. And it's insane that this happened, but the dude who stood in their way would be a familiar face, and the Lions had to take down the ghost of their past to reach happiness. I still can't believe it. It's Matthew Stafford. He's back! And although this game is still very recent, it cannot be understated how absurd it is that Matthew Stafford was actually playing against the same team he played on for 12 years in his first ever playoff game since his Super Bowl win. And of course, the media marketed this game as the Clash of the Titans. What would be stronger, the Lions' new culture or the embodiment of the Lions' past in Matthew Stafford? And the game had already instantly just become a classic by the narrative alone, but thank God that the product actually put on the field was also just, it was perfect. As requested by Roger Goodell himself, I'm sure, the Lions' defensive game plan, led by defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn, was to stop the Rams' run game and make Matthew Stafford beat them. And to his credit, he almost did it. Nobody knew Matthew Stafford better than Lions fans, and even though by the game's end, Matty Stafford racked up at least 6 injuries, the dude was honestly the best player on the field, and it's really sad to think about, but Matthew Stafford, I feel like, would absolutely thrive on this Lions team, but that's the price of success and the irony of this whole thing. Sometimes sacrifices need to be made, and you can't really do anything about terrible timing, and in return, Matthew Stafford would be the last barricade that needed to be knocked down in order for the Lions to reach true success. Early on in the game, the Lions offense was just unstoppable. Jared Goff was absolutely in the zone, and with Aaron Donald neutralized, the Rams got a solid 0 pressure, which resulted in a 14-3 crater that the Rams were never able to crawl out of. But like I said, Matthew Stafford left everything on the field. But in the end, the Detroit Lions did it. Ford Field had been breaking sound barriers all game long because for the first time since the early 90s, 1991 to be exact, the Detroit Lions hosted and won a playoff game. They actually did it! Sheila Ford, Brad Holmes, Dan Campbell, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jared Goff, and everyone else that helped in the cause brought one of the NFL's worst franchises back from the dead. And we ain't done yet. If you think that Dan Campbell is going to be satisfied with one playoff win, you'd be goddamn mistaken. And they now turn to the divisional round where the Tampa Bay Buccaneers would be waiting, as they just kind of stood there in the wild card as the Eagles bled themselves to death. And now all the focus went towards, could Dan Campbell keep the Lions motivated and hungry to keep going further in the playoffs?
This is just the beginning, boys.
Job finished? I don't think so.
Like I said, though, luckily the Lions were playing Tampa Bay, who honestly were only here because the NFC South wasn't even real this past year and, general Philly shenanigans. But to their credit, Tampa battled Detroit hard. But in the end, the Lions emerged victorious again with a last-second interception. And I might shed a tear. We've come so far, and now the Detroit Lions moved on to the NFC Championship, where once again, let me say that again. Do you know what that means? That means the Lions were one game away from making the Super Bowl. However, not all fairy tales have a happy ending. Although they've gotten this far for now, you can't take the Detroit out of the Lions. And that's the most depressing lesson from this video. Maybe nothing will change. Maybe this entire 2023 campaign was just a blip on the radar and they're going to completely relapse. And the NFC Championship showed maybe glimpses of that because everything was going almost perfectly in the first half, but it all came crumbling down. The Lions' opponent in this game was the San Francisco 49ers, but honestly, damn near that didn't matter at all, because if you did watch this game, you'd know it was quite literally the Lions versus the Lions. And for the climax of this video, the only villain that the Lions could face in their final trial would be the Detroit Lions themselves. Like I said, Ben Johnson was in the Matrix early on, but all it took was one 49ers drive and a few other plays going wrong, and I could go ape wild if you want me to right now, screaming about literally everything that just crumbled around the Lions, and most of it was entirely their fault, but I'm not doing that right now, okay? I don't want this video to go on for another 20 minutes, okay? I'll save that rant for another time. Just know all it took for everything to just break was one singular play. And although debates can be had on the decision to go for it on 4th down, it can't be ignored that if Josh Reynolds was able to bring in this ball, the Lions would have likely just won the game. However, he didn't. Josh Reynolds f***ing dropped it. And something, 5 drops later, a fumble, and a few of the luckiest plays in sports history happening, and me trying not to myself. And now what we have is a Lions NFC Championship loss, 31-34, as they fell just one game short of reaching the Super Bowl. Now, this loss for the Lions is it's absolutely devastating. That can't be understated, but once again, there are just so many great positives to take away from this year. They've proved that at times, the Lions can escape the pit. They can actually move past their horrible ways of choking and just being an overall horrible franchise. And there is so much to look forward to in the future. And if you can get a year like what we just saw, what else can the future hold? So it has been a hell of a journey. And thank you for watching this video if you've gotten to this point. But maybe, just maybe, the Detroit Lions will only get better from here, and possibly this one sad sack of a franchise has managed to escape despair and has become truly reborn. Anyways, if you like this video, then subscribe, because I got a lot of videos on the channel just like this one, and if you did like it, then watch this video that I did a few weeks back on Tom Brady and the entire New England Patriots dynasty. It's pretty good, trust me. It's 2 hours, but it's probably worth the watch. And thanks to all my Patreons for pledging $1. It truly means a lot, but anyways, until next time.